Hi, my name is Clara, and I'm 39. I live in a quiet house on a quiet street, the kind of place where days repeat and nothing really asks anything of you. Some mornings, I don't remember what I did the day before. Others, I find myself staring at the same mark on the kitchen wall, wondering when it even got there. But that Thursday, the wind shifted, and the silence in the hallway didn't feel like mine anymore. I often sat by the window in the late afternoon with a cup of tea that had gone cold long before I noticed. The house was quiet in a way that didn't comfort me anymore. The kind of quiet that wraps around you like an old sweater, familiar but itchy in all the wrong places. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon detergent and leftover roast. In the living room, the television hummed softly, stuck on some late talk show rerun. My husband had fallen asleep on the recliner again, hand resting on his stomach, his glasses still on. I folded the last towel in the laundry basket and stared at the empty chair across the table. It wasn't supposed to mean anything. A chair is just a chair. But lately it had begun to look more like a pause, like someone was always about to sit there and never did. There wasn't anything wrong, not really. We still spoke kindly to each other. We still remembered birthdays and school events and who liked cream in their coffee and who didn't. There were goodnight kisses, grocery runs, polite laughter. But somewhere along the way, something quieter than words had shifted between us, a dullness that felt heavier with each passing season. I carried my tea to the window and stood there watching the light fade along the edge of the neighbor's fence. The steam was long gone, but I held the cup anyway, like it could anchor me. Our daughter was in her room, likely texting or scrolling through something that wouldn't matter tomorrow. The dog we always said we'd get never arrived. The garage still needed organizing, and I couldn't remember the last time I'd been touched without it being routine, without it being a hand on the back, as one of us passed by. That's when I caught my reflection in the glass. Not really a face, just a blur of color and outline. I tilted my head slightly as if looking at myself from a different angle might bring something into focus. It didn't. I could hear my husband shifting in the recliner, a soft sigh escaping him. I didn't turn. I set the tea down on the window ledge. The condensation left a faint ring. The dining table behind me was clean, except for a cloth napkin someone forgot to take to the laundry. I walked over, folded it with care, placed it on the stack of linens, then stood still, listening. Not for anything particular, just listening in case something broke the silence. But it didn't. My phone buzzed once in my pocket, a low vibration. Probably a calendar reminder or a promotional text from the store. I didn't look. I walked back to the kitchen, wiped the already clean counter, opened the fridge, closed it again. The evening was slipping through the cracks of our well-kept life. I looked at the clock. 6:42 p.m. Too early for bed, too late for coffee. I returned to the window out of habit more than intention, and that's when I heard it. A knock. Soft. Deliberate. At the back door. I froze not out of fear but recognition. I knew that knock. It wasn't loud, but it was familiar. Daniel never used the front door. He always knocked gently on the back. That detail had stayed with me long before it meant anything. There was something unassuming about it, as if he knew not to disturb the order of things, as if he knew the front door belonged to someone else. That evening I opened it without asking who was there. He stood with a toolbox in one hand and a casual ease in his posture, like someone returning to a familiar rhythm. The air between us was thick with the scent of pine and fading daylight. You mentioned the basement light was flickering. He said, not quite smiling, not quite serious. I did, I answered, stepping aside. He walked in with the quiet confidence of someone who had fixed things before, not just the wiring, but the silence in a room. The kind of silence that gets too loud if left unattended. I led him downstairs. The basement wasn't unfinished or eerie. It was clean carpeted in beige with wooden shelves that bowed slightly under the weight of board games and old photo albums. A couch sagged in the middle, not enough to matter, just enough to notice. Daniel pulled the light cover off, whistling under his breath. I stayed nearby, pretending to rearrange the shelves, running my fingers along dustless surfaces. Should be a quick fix, he said. It's the starter. I nodded, though I didn't know what that meant. There was a moment when I turned to hand him a screwdriver. Our hands didn't touch, but they almost did, and I looked up just slightly too long. He looked away first. "I'll grab the replacement from the truck," he said, voice even. He came back with the part, and we didn't speak much after that. Just the occasional question about which breaker to switch or where I kept the ladder. I stood on the third rung holding the fixture in place while he adjusted the wiring. My balance shifted just enough to lose it. His hand caught my hip, light but certain. I didn't flinch. Neither did he. There was nothing suggestive in the touch, but it lingered just half a second longer than it should have. When I stepped down, neither of us said a word. He packed up slowly, winding the cord with care, tapping the screws into a small tin. The air felt heavier than it should have for such a small job. As he turned to leave, he paused by the door. "You okay?" he asked. 3 words, and my throat tightened. I wanted to say yes. Of course I did. That was the script. But instead I looked at him, really looked, and realized that I hadn't been asked that question in a very long time, at least not in a way that sounded like it wanted the truth. I opened my mouth, and nothing came out. I started going into the garage more often. Not to find anything. More like I was trying to find myself. There wasn't much in there, just storage bins we hadn't labeled, shelves with half-used paint cans, an old folding chair we never brought to the beach. But somehow, the quiet there felt less hollow. It gave my mind a place to settle, to breathe without performing. That Sunday morning, the rain came in soft sheets, not heavy enough to be dramatic, just enough to curtain the view outside. I opened the garage door halfway and stood beneath it, watching the droplets tap across the concrete. I told myself I was reorganizing, that I needed to go through the holiday boxes or figure out what to do with the broken lamp we never fixed. But when I pulled out the kitschy wooden shelf I had once meant to repaint, I found myself dusting it off, placing it on the workbench, and searching for brushes. I didn't expect him, but the soft knock, too short one pause on the side door, gave me away. I didn't even pretend not to know. Daniel stood there, hoodie damp from the rain, holding a small metal case. "Thought I left my wrench set here." "You probably did," I said. He stepped in without needing an invitation. His shoes left faint prints on the floor, and we didn't speak for the first few minutes. He walked past me, paused at the workbench, and tilted his head. "You finally decided to fix that?" "I guess," I murmured. "Seems like a good day for paint." He didn't offer to help. Not right away. He just stood nearby watching as I opened the can and stirred the pale gray into something resembling effort. I dipped the brush, lifted it, hesitated. Then, without a word, he reached for another brush, dipped it, and started on the other side. We painted in silence. But it wasn't empty. There was a rhythm to it. The soft rasp of bristles, the occasional tap of wood against the bench. Outside, the rain kept its own slow cadence. Inside, we matched it stroke for stroke. At one point, I glanced over and found him looking at me. Not intensely. Just seeing. I looked away first. "I haven't painted anything in years," I said, mostly to the shelf. "You should," he replied. "You're good at it." We worked until the second coat blurred the imperfections. Then we stopped, letting the paint dry while the silence settled again. I went to the small shelf near the door and took down the old radio. It still worked if you twisted the dial just right. I adjusted it until a low jazz melody filled the space, scratchy, soft, oddly comforting. He leaned against the wall. I stood across from him. The shelf between us like a polite boundary neither of us questioned. When I turned to rinse the brushes, I felt his gaze again. It didn't pull. It didn't ask. It just held. I dried my hands on a towel, then looked back. His eyes didn't move. And I felt something stir. Not lust. Not longing. Recognition. He saw me. Not the wife. Not the mother. Not the predictable Tuesday night meal planner. Just me. I wanted to ask him what he saw. Wanted to ask what kind of woman I was to him, standing here with paint on her fingers and silence in her throat. But I didn't. Instead, I walked over to the small kettle by the door, poured water into the old plug-in pot, and filled 2 mugs with loose tea. When I handed him one, he took it without comment. I held my own mug tightly, letting the warmth bleed into my palms. We didn't toast. We didn't sip at the same time. But for the first time in a long while, I had poured a second cup. I started avoiding the garage, as if that space had begun holding a secret I didn't trust myself with. For days, I found excuses to stay out of it. The rain helped. The air had turned colder enough to claim the chill seeped into my joints. I folded laundry, reorganized the spice rack, cleaned the windows, anything to keep my hands too busy to reach for the doorknob. Daniel hadn't texted again. Not since the last message, "I can swing by next week if you still need help with the shelving." I hadn't replied. I wasn't sure what "still need help" even meant anymore. Every time I walked past the door to the garage, I'd slow down without realizing it. I'd feel the stillness on the other side, feel the weight of what we hadn't said pressing against the wood. I kept waiting for the knock. It never came. One evening, I set the table early, placed 2 candles in the center, like I used to. I made lemon chicken. His favorite, used the good plates, lit the small tea lights in the windowsill. It felt like a gesture, like I was trying to mark my way back to something I'd lost the map for. When he came home, my husband noticed. He smiled. "Smells amazing in here." He kissed my cheek, complimented the food, poured us both wine. We ate, we talked. He told me about a meeting that ran long, about an issue with the printer at work. I nodded, refilled his glass when it emptied, laughed in the right places. It was fine. Everything was fine. Until midway through the movie, he picked his head, tilted back against the recliner, and he was asleep again. The flicker of the screen played across his face. I sat on the other couch, wineglass in hand, untouched. I muted the TV. The house went quiet except for the occasional pop of the heating vents and the hum of the fridge. I looked at the clock, 9:47 p.m. Too late to pretend I wasn't waiting for something else. I got up, gathered the plates that still smelled faintly of rosemary, rinsed them under water that was too hot, scrubbed too long. The steam fogged the window over the sink. I wiped it with the side of my wrist and saw nothing but the dark outside. Still I stood there. I dried my hands. Then, without thinking, I opened the back door and stepped out into the cold. The porch light buzzed softly overhead. I wrapped my cardigan tighter around me and looked toward the edge of the yard, toward the curb, the driveway, the part of the street where his car sometimes idled before pulling in. It was empty. And somehow that absence said more than his presence ever could. I leaned against the railing and exhaled slowly. The breath clouded in front of me, then drifted away like it didn't belong here either. I whispered to myself, if he shows up again, I'll tell him not to come back. But I was lying. The truth was, I didn't know what I'd say. And it didn't matter, because he didn't come. The radio turned on by itself that morning. Just static at first. Then the soft hum of a cello, deep, long trembling. I hadn't touched the dial. I'd barely even gone into the living room all week. But there it was, filling the quiet with something that sounded like grief disguised as music. I didn't move to turn it off. I stood barefoot in the doorway, coffee growing cold in my hands, and let the sound pull me somewhere else. Not backward, not forward, just inward. The knock came at 8:12 a.m., 3 gentle raps. I didn't rush to answer. I just watched the door from the end of the hallway as if it might open on its own. When it didn't, I stepped forward. Daniel looked different. Not tired, just undecorated. His hair slightly damp from the fog, his eyes quieter than usual. He had both hands in his jacket pockets. "I thought I'd drop off the brackets I promised," he said, "for the shelves." I nodded. "You didn't have to, I know." We stood like that, half inside, half out, until I realized I hadn't invited him in. He didn't seem to mind. "I'm not staying," he added. "I just thought—" His voice trailed off like it had nowhere to land. There was a pause, the kind that almost becomes an ending. Then I asked, "Do you have 5 minutes?" He blinked once, then nodded. I led him to the kitchen. It was tidy, too tidy. I had cleaned it twice the day before. There was a cup already set across the table from mine. I hadn't known why until now. We sat. Neither of us touched the tea. The cello from the radio still lingered faintly, like it had settled into the walls. "I thought maybe you were avoiding me," he said gently. "I was," I replied. He looked up. "Because of something I did know. Because of something I felt." It was the first time I'd said it aloud. I didn't look at him when I did. I've lived a very orderly life, I continued. Everything in its place. Predictable. Safe. Even lonely if you want to know the truth. He didn't interrupt. He just listened. And then you walked in through the back, I added, and something shifted. Another silence. This one warmer. He nodded once. I felt it too, that was all. No dramatic confessions. No grasping for a future. Just a simple acknowledgement of something that had already bloomed and wilted in the same breath. I'm not asking for anything, I said, I know, but I needed to say it somewhere real. He reached across the table, not to hold my hand, not to close a distance, but to gently slide his mug toward him. His fingers brushed the ceramic, then let go. That's enough, he said softly. Saying it, I looked up. Our eyes met. It didn't ache like I thought it would. The light in the garage had burned out days ago, but I hadn't replaced it. I kind of liked it better dim. That evening I stood at the doorway with a new bulb in one hand and a quiet resolve in the other. The ladder creaked beneath me as I reached up, fingers twisting glass into socket, until the light blinked back to life, gentle yellow uneven. It made the space look older, but less cold. There were still his fingerprints on the shelf, faint smudges where he'd once balanced the level where his wrist had brushed the wall. I didn't wipe them off. I didn't want to. After that morning, he hadn't stayed long. Just a brief touch of conversation, enough to settle something that had been restless in both of us. He left without promises. I watched from the kitchen window as he turned the corner of the block and disappeared. But something had shifted quietly, like weather. That night, I sat in the living room alone, the cello from the radio playing a song I didn't know the name of. My husband had gone to bed early. I didn't follow. Instead, I walked out to the porch with a blanket and a cup of mint tea, sat in the old wicker chair I hadn't used in months. The night air had a softness to it, like fabric worn thin. Across the street, a porch light flickered in the neighbor's yard. A cat crossed the road and paused near the hedges. Somewhere faintly, someone was playing piano through an open window. I thought about Daniel, about the shelf, the tea, the space between us that had never closed but had been seen. I didn't know if I'd see him again. I didn't need to. What lingered wasn't longing. It was permission. To feel more. To ask less. To notice how silent sounds when it isn't empty. I reached for the old cardigan he once said suited me, wrapped it tighter. It smelled faintly of cedar and fabric softener. In the kitchen behind me, the radio switched to static. I didn't go back in to fix it. The porch still creaked when the wind passed through, like a voice that hadn't quite left. In the garage, the bulb she had replaced cast a quiet halo over the empty shelves. He hadn't come back, but neither had the silence returned to what it was before. Some moments arrive with no explanation and stay without asking for more. She didn't close the door that night.